if the USA didn't use atomic bombs against Japan in World War II? The alternative was Operation Downfall. Operation Downfall was the proposed Allied plan for the invasion of the Japanese home islands near the end of World War II in Asia. Casualty estimates vary greatly. However, the most frequently cited estimates are 250,000 Allied dead, 750,000 Allied wounded. Estimates of Japanese casualties vary widely as well. However, the slogan, "The sooner the Americans come, the better, 100 million die proudly," sums up the Japanese thinking. I'd argue that war is morally wrong and unethical. There are rare cases where the alternative is even more morally wrong and unethical. World War II was about as clear-cut a case as exists in human history, where there was a monstrous evil that controlled multiple nations, which drove them to engage in some of the most horrific acts of mass murder in history. Other nations had a choice of resisting this evil, ignoring it, and hoping someone else took care of it for them, or passively to actively supporting that evil. Those who chose to fight this monstrous evil engaged in a war of machines and production. Directly thrown into battle were tanks, guns, explosives, aircrafts, ships, submarines, rockets, bombs, torpedoes, and so on. To create those machines required mines, factories, and shipyards, while getting the weapons to where they needed to go required railways, trucks, roads, bridges, ports, airfields, and aircraft. Fuel and lubricants were required for the weapons and for the transporting of weapons where they needed to go. Food was needed to sustain the military, the workers, and the general populace of the warring nations. Winning World War II meant ending the enemy's willingness or ability to continue to fight. That end goal could be achieved by defeating the armies, navies, and air power in battle, or by destroying the means of producing the weapons the enemy needed to fight. Use of atomic weapons against Japan was an accepted tactic using this weapon. An accepted way of fighting World War II was attacking the means of production and the means of transporting the equipment used where it was needed. That meant attacking factories, shipyards, roads, bridges, shipping, railcars, railroads, and waterways. Naturally, many of these targets were in or around cities. The use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a continuation of the attack that had been accepted as the way modern wars were fought in World War II. Attack the enemy's production capacity and logistics. Ironically, the US is criticized for attacking civilians when they were the last major power in the war to use that tactic, which was initiated by the Japanese in Asia and Germany in Europe, then adopted by the RAF in 1942. The US came to that party late in 1945, and somehow gets most of the criticism for it. The use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the same tactic using a new weapon. Evolution of bombing in World War II. When World War II started in Europe with the invasion of Poland, Germany was merciless in its attacks on Polish targets, including cities, but strict rules of engagement were used by Britain, France, and Germany in regards to attacks on one another. All three countries refused to bomb targets on land in the countries that they were at war with. Ships at sea were an exception and were attacked when a target presented itself. This continued until May of 1940, with the invasion of France, Belgium, and Holland. Even then, cities were off the target list until Rotterdam was bombed, which shocked the world. Even during the Battle of France, attacks on cities were avoided. Once France fell and the Battle of Britain started, the targets were still military. That changed in September of 1940, when London was accidentally bombed by a small number of German bombers who were off course and bombed London by mistake. The British retaliated by sending a small number of bombers to Berlin. After that, the gloves came off and Germany targeted London and other British cities. Also worthy to note is that at the start of the war, the bombing was largely done by daylight, and that allowed for more accurate delivery of bombs on smaller targets. The RAF quickly found that its bombers could not survive in daylight attacks, so it switched to attacking at night, making it extremely difficult to hit small targets. Still, that was the RAF policy: attack military targets, not cities, although the target could be in a city. But the first weeks of September of 1940, the Germans knew that they too took unacceptable losses in daylight raids, and largely switched to attacks at night. In 1941 or 1942, the RAF did an experiment where they had their bombers take a photo when they dropped their bombs to determine the accuracy of their attacks. If I recall correctly, the conclusion was that less of half the bombs they dropped came within 5 miles of the intended target. The study proved what many had thought, that their bombing effort was largely a wasted effort due to the inaccuracy of the attacks. RAF Bomber Command switched from targeting cities where war manufacturing was being carried out. No longer was the RAF going after a specific factory or refinery. It went after the cities they were located in. The US AAF, 8th Air Force, started to arrive in the UK during 1942 with the belief that they could attack targets in daylight. 8th Air Force strength grew gradually in 1942, then got cut in half by supplying bombers of North Africa, then grew steadily in 1943. The number of aircraft sent on missions during that period grew as the size of the available forces increased. For the most part, the US stuck to its policy of targeting specific military targets. However, as the size of the bombing force increased, so did the damage to the cities the US attacked. When the bombing of Japan by B-29 started in 1944, the concept of attacking cities was an accepted method of war. Still, the US started by attacking specific military and industrial targets, but found that the attacks by B-29s from high altitudes were far less accurate than the results achieved in lower altitudes in Europe. This led to experiments with attacking at night by bombing at lower levels with incendiary bombs, which proved very successful in destroying the cities and the industrial targets within them. By August 1945, the idea of attacking a city that contained military and industrial targets was viewed as the way modern wars were fought. Evaluating the ethics of an action or a lack of action requires context. The context of the use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that Japan was at war with the US and other allied nations, and had demonstrated quite clearly that they had no intention of surrender on terms acceptable to the Allies. When the US took Okinawa earlier in 1945, the death toll was 12,500 US dead, 95,000 Japanese military dead, and 95,000 Japanese civilians dead. Many of the civilians committed suicide. In a number of cases, parents killed their children and then themselves. Why? They were ordered by the Japanese army. Estimated cost in the US lives to invade Japan Operation Downfall was 250,000 killed. Using a ratio of Japanese killed to the US killed on Okinawa as a yardstick, you get 1,900,000 Japanese military deaths and roughly the same number of civilian deaths. I'd argue that Japanese casualties would have been far higher than that. Those who argue that Japan was defeated before the atomic bombs were used ignore the whole history of the Pacific War. The Japanese did not surrender. They fought to the death and would commit suicide before allowing themselves to be captured. To understand this, you need to understand the Japanese culture of the time. To the Japanese, surrender is a disgrace not only to the individual who surrendered, but also his entire family, including his ancestors who were revered. To the Japanese, Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen who were captures were low-life scum, undeserving of being kept alive. The Japanese were mystified that Allied prisoners expected to be treated well and absolutely could not understand it when they actually wanted their families to be notified of their capture. Imagine wanting your family to know that you had disgraced them. Unthinkable. So, what did the Allies demand of Japan? Surrender. Unconditional surrender. They would rather die. It also helps to understand Japan's war aims. They seized a great deal of territory in the Pacific, China, and Southeast Asia, except for the Central and South Central Pacific still held most of it at the end of the war. Their aim was never to conquer the US. It was a Pacific Asian empire. Their aim was to inflict enough casualties on the Allies such that we'd simply not be willing to pay the price to take it from them. That aim was still plausible in 1945 until atomic bombs convinced them that Japan could and would be annihilated with a few losses on the part of the US. Then they surrendered. Use of the atomic bombs ended the war far quicker and with fewer casualties on both sides than any alternative available to the US or our allies. Was it moral or ethical? No. It was simply far less immoral and unethical than any alternative available to the Allies. Okay, that's it. Share this video with your friends, make sure they stay safe, and we will appreciate your likes. The more of them we get, the the more people will be able to see this video. You can watch the other video here on the left or right side, and make sure you subscribe to this channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell icon so you'll be updated on all new uploads.